Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of V Radio. Tonight we have a special I have a fever and a really terrible chest cough thing going on episode. So if my voice sounds a little bit weird, that would be why, but the show must go on. Today, once again, V Radio is honored to have Professor Roger Stahl from Militainment Incorporated and now from Returning Fire, Interventions into the Video Game Culture. First of all, before we get started, I want to thank everybody who has donated to support V Radio. You guys did exactly what I was asking, which is, if a lot of people give just a little bit, then that's fine. It's not that I don't appreciate it when you guys give those big chunks of money, but you know, if you want to do that, if it looks like for some reason there's no donations coming in, that's different. But overall, just a couple dollars per listener is fine, per month. That being said, exactly what I was asking, which is, if a lot of people give just a little bit... Roger, you're going to want to pause the show. That's why you're hearing us twice. You have a link open with the show. Anyway, it happens all the time. $2 per listener is fine. So, can you find it?
Yes.
If it comes down to it, just close your browsers. But in any case, thanks again to everybody who supported V Radio. Now, tonight we're going to be discussing Roger's new film, as I had said earlier, Returning Fire. You can go to my recent review of the film. He gave me the privilege of being able to get a sneak preview of the film for the purpose of review. You can read that review at my blog by going to v-radio.org. That's vradio.org with basically a minus between the V and the radio. And if you hit blog, then you'll see my review. So, yeah, Roger, I can still hear the show on whatever other computer or whatever you're doing there.
I don't have a browser open. I'm trying to fix it. Sorry about that.
That's okay. If it comes down to it, you may have to... I've never had this happen before. You may have to restart, but either way, although it sounds like it just cut out. Anyway, well, Roger, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience again. You never know when there's new listeners.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the show again, Neil.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Roger Stahl. I'm an associate professor at the University of Georgia in the communication department. And I do a number of things, including study the relationship between war and entertainment, which is the subject of today's interview. I made a film a couple of years ago that Neil mentioned already called Militainment, Inc., and also a book by that name that came out last year, which studied the military entertainment complex in relation to video games, reality television, film, Pentagon, Hollywood relationships, and other things like that. And I decided I would sort of finish off that stream of research, or that interest, with a film about not just critical approaches to the military entertainment complex, but a film about how people were engaging the complex through creative forms of activism. And that is the subject of this new film that Neil wanted to talk about today, called Returning Fire, Interventions in Video Game Culture. It's also got another subtitle for another market, Hacking War Game Culture. So those two together might give you an idea of what it's about.
Right, and I have to say that the film definitely impacted me a lot. I felt the need to write the review immediately. I think that a large part of it was, just as I brought up during the review itself, was just that it really helps you to think about the impact that the marketing of this sort of thing has on you, the way it changes your outlook, the way it changes your dreams. It's one of the things that I said in my my recent review was that I remember when militarization of the culture, made me from just wanting to be an astronaut to wanting to be a fighter pilot. To essentially, I don't want to say worshiping, but seriously thinking very highly of weapons, and that's that techno-fetishism thing that you were talking about in Militainment that I had never really thought about before. And then I was like, I caught myself just the other day thinking, man, the YF-22 Raptor is a really pretty jet. I'm like, I'm talking about a frickin' killing machine. You know, you don't even think about it. And they do a really good job of really making it interesting, which is something that, you pointed out in, Militainment, and that is also true in the video game culture in a way that I think is, in some ways, it's even worse, especially since we have our kids involved with these projects. Our children are playing these very, very realistic war games that are getting more and more realistic all the time. I know just the toys and the cartoons, the G.I. Joe stuff when I was growing up in the 80s, did a lot for my militarization attitude. And the video games of the times, were much more primitive, but I still remember playing, the Rambo game on Nintendo and, different games like that. It definitely contributed a lot to what I was thinking about doing, and that kind of leads you on to the line that it's all part of essentially a master plan, so to speak, to get people interested in the military. And I still remember, it was one thing I didn't put in the blog, was after I got out of high school and had already decided I wasn't going to join the military, they kept sending me stuff for years, hoping they could rope me in. And it's the other unfortunate aspect that I left out of the blog that I remember learning back at that time of my life was that a lot of my friends were kind of, I don't want to say forced into joining the military, but when you go into all of the unemployment places, you see recruitment posters. I have two different friends who, due to the depressed economy in Michigan, joined the military because they couldn't find any other ways to feed their families. It's almost like they don't have to have a draft. They'll just, tank the economy until people have no choice but to get a job on the Army or the Marines or whatever. But as far as factoring in on this issue in particular, I thought about not just about the war aspect of it, but the violence aspect of it. We talked about this on a previous V radio show. I don't know if you're familiar with the Grand Theft Auto series, but there's one in particular called Vice City, which is basically based on kind of the cocaine time period of the 80s, complete with the music and the Miami Vice look and everybody. And I remember that most of the people that I know, probably 3/4, if not 90% of the people that I know who played that game, did not log on even to take part in the story. And although there was a pretty involved, typical mob story, most people didn't even bother with that. They just logged on because of the way the game interface was. You could just randomly attack people on the street. So they'd just get a baseball bat and just randomly beat somebody to death. And it was very graphic. There'd be a pool of blood underneath them and everything. And I'm like, this is just, you don't really think about it until, you've put things into perspective, but the dehumanization that comes out of this, the notion that could ever be part of entertainment, is pretty sad.
Yeah, well, that's one of those games that falls under the genre of quote-unquote sandbox games, which is pretty free-form stuff. You could almost call them id games, id games. Because they really allow people to act out some of the darkest fantasies and, have been sold for that purpose. And you're right, for something like Grand Theft Auto, the entire series, the storyline is secondary to, whether you have sort of the option to beat somebody with a baseball bat or shoot up a mall or, screw a prostitute and, kill a prostitute after you're done screwing her. I suppose it really exposes the sort of dark underbelly of humanity. But, we have all kinds of media that exploit that id aspect. And Grand Theft Auto just does it expertly.
Yeah, and in a way that I didn't really realize how bad it was until, because, I didn't generally just find myself randomly walking along beating up passersby, but you do, one of the things about that game is you can do all kinds of crazy stunts with the vehicles, and this tends to get the cops after you, of course, and, so there's that aspect of it. But that's another thing that I recognized in our culture. I participate in a live-action role-playing game, for example, and there are a lot of this current generation in particular, they like to play the part of criminals in the role-playing game, because they can go be bad, so to speak, in a world where there isn't really any consequences for their actions. They can be free to, be criminals in that setting and, kind of get their fantasy of putting their nose in the air up at their bosses or whatever, or they throw off their shackles, so to speak. And that kind of brings me back to one of the other things that I mentioned in the blog was that, I have a friend who plays more Counter-Strike than any human being should ever do anything. And, he worked in the restaurant industry, which is a very stressful thing, especially if it's fast food. And he'd come home and he'd want to shoot people. Not literally, of course, but in the same fashion, in a very realistic fashion, he would just sit there and play Counter-Strike for hours and hours and hours. That's all the guy would do. You couldn't get him out of his room if it was time to play Counter-Strike. And he got his aggressions off that way, essentially. That fantasy you're talking about. And I understand that too. I think that's one of the things, especially when you're talking about the non-military aspect. Like if you've ever seen that film with Michael Douglas, Falling Down, that guy kind of lives a lot of people's fantasies for the first 3/4 of the film. And in a lot of ways, I think it's a reaction to some of the problems we have in our society that just forever put us in a position where we feel like we're downtrodden or being pushed around, and and in some cases the reaction to that is negative, and it's unfortunate that that's the way things are glorified. It's tough, really. That's the other thing I've noticed is that the good guy is really falling out of fashion. Any of these times I play any of these online games, for example, I find myself being one of the only people willing to play one of the quote-unquote good characters. Everybody else wants to take the negative point of view. And I see that becoming more and more prevalent over time. We don't have a lot of, I always said to people, when the Star Wars Episode 1 thing came out, nobody remembers who Qui-Gon Jinn is, but they remember who Darth Maul is. That kind of prioritization of the bad guy it's kind of sad, actually. It's one of the reasons why, my own children, I'm very careful about what I let them watch and what I let them play. But as far as to the military aspect of all of this, coming back to the main point, we talked, basically the film that you made covers 3 different stories. The first of which was about a fellow, I think named Delape. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, close. Joseph Delap.
Delap, right. He basically just took it upon himself one day to start logging into America's recruitment America's Army, and basically go in there and, you have these people that are endlessly playing this free online first-person shooter that's of the first order. They put a lot of money into this. It's just as high quality as Modern Warfare or any of the other games that you got out there that people are paying for. And the whole purpose of the game is to glorify being part of the Army, and they put you in situations that are just like Iraq and Afghanistan. And so he logs in there to start bringing some very real realism to the game. He starts reading off the names and death, basically the names of soldiers who had died. I don't remember how much detail he got into. Did he say how they died or where they died?
He didn't say how or where. He gave the name of the soldier, the date of death, the age of the soldier when the soldier died, and I believe the rank. And those were that was what was entered each time he addressed a soldier in the game. And he did so through the text messaging system in the upper left-hand corner. He basically typed it in all caps, so he tried to draw attention to it. And then it sort of floated down the screen and disappeared eventually, and he would continue typing in names until he was shot. And that whole process took about 30 seconds.
Right.
Because he dropped his weapon, in order to type. But then, of course, would, observe, sort of sit back and observe what other players' responses were to this very elegant and simple provocation.
That's an interesting point that he brought up that is another aspect of realism that I think is generally left off the table, and that is something that, because as I said in the blog, I was being very, I was making a lot of confessions myself about how I recognized what had been done to me via your work, recognizing what had been done to me by the military-industrial complex and such, via your work. I got to really understand why I felt the way I did about the military, and one of the things that they leave out of the realism factor, because they were bragging that their medics were more realistic in America's Army, because you'd have to do, like, you know, real medic-like things, and then the guy pointed out, he's like, that's not real medic stuff, because in real medic stuff, you know, you get maimed for life, and, you know, they don't put the part in the game where you're being pushed around in a wheelchair, or where, you know, maybe, you know, that's if you survived, of course. You know, they don't put the part in the game where your family is gathered around mourning you, and you know, at your funeral, and one of them hands you a folded American flag. That part of the soldier's career who's been shot is, of course, left off the table, because that wouldn't be a very good recruitment tool, and it certainly wouldn't sell a lot of video games. You know, and that's a dark aspect of this, especially in these first-person shooters. You don't even think about it, because you respawn within 10 to 20 seconds, sometimes even faster than that. You know, and you're just right back in the game all over again, and it doesn't even occur to you that you essentially just represented an entire life. You were a person. You know, you were representing the avatar of a human being, you know, who likely had parents, you know, who had people who cared about him, you know, who had perhaps dreams and aspirations. You know, that's an aspect of war that I think gets left off the table entirely too much, you know, and that's why I often tell people, and I'm going to bring it up again, and I think I brought this up in the last show I had you on, Roger, you know, with Peter and Ben Stewart, was the fact that, you know, we don't realize, you know, also the victims, the other side of it. You know, it's like when people die in war, it doesn't even really occur to us that these are people. We see maybe the little snippets of it on, you know, on CNN. You get better footage, better meaning more graphic, on Al Jazeera, because they're a bit more honest, in my opinion. You know, but you see people crying, you know, and you don't really think about the fact that they're real people. You know, that there's a person on the other side of that there's somebody's son on the other side of that there's, you know, maybe somebody's brother. You know, or in the case of the girls, you know, obviously you got children and women getting killed in these wars too. That's basically, you know, another aspect of it that's just completely left off, and you certainly don't see that in the video games. You know, the whole aspect that there are innocent people that are getting killed, and that was another point that you made in the film that was very poignant, was that the violence in these war games, ironically, is not very graphic. You know, you just kind of get shot, and then you just kind of fall over, you know, and that's it. There isn't really much more to it than that. Ironically, the Grand Theft Auto games and some of the fighting games, for example, are more graphic than these military games, and that's a pretty obvious ploy to, you know, to make war look clean. I mean, wouldn't you say?
It depends. You know, it seems like the games that approach actual ongoing operations around the world tend to shy away from really graphic depictions of war. So, in a sense, the more realistic, the more verisimilitude there is in a game in terms of its relationship to an actual conflict, you know, the cleaner it is. And that's sort of a rule of thumb. Although I do believe that if you look across the entire spectrum of war-themed video games, all the way from, you know, Call of Duty and Medal of Honor, you know, World War II games through Vietnam and current conflicts, I think there is a broad trend toward more graphic depictions in general, and I think the general revulsion that often results in political resistance to these types of games is being gradually worn down. I think as a society we're being acclimated to more gruesome games in general.
Right. But oddly enough, I mean, you don't seem to see it much in the military games, and that's the ironic thing about it is, especially in some of these games, you're using weapons that would cause a lot of carnage. Like, you know, Modern Warfare 2, you're using grenade launchers, rocket launchers sometimes. Occasionally, you're firing from vehicles. You know, and it's so everybody lands on the ground dead with all their body parts still attached, you know, with no obvious sign that they're dead. They could just as easily be unconscious as far as the eye of the beholder. And that, I think, kind of plays into this notion that it allows you to continue to think that war is cool still. You know, that it's interesting, or, you know, that there's no repercussions for what it is that you're getting into.
Well, it's important for a game like America's Army, where they're actually trying to recruit people into situations where their lives might be in danger. It's not as important for, you know, Call of Duty, Modern Warfare,
right.
where there's a little bit more license to show that kind of, death and violence and gore in the service of, giving the game a lot more punch.
Right, and that's, the one thing that I remember, because I asked myself a while ago, because I still played these games for a long time, even after I became an activist. And I asked myself, why is it that I can still stomach these games? And one of the other things that they have in those games is that the plot, you generally are actually a good guy. You're a good person in those stories. You're getting the bad guys. They don't add any of the other aspects to it. They don't add the military-industrial complex aspects, the corporations or corrupt politicians. They don't add any of the other factors of war into it. And, of course, you're never in a situation to, say, kill any innocent civilians. That doesn't even get, you don't even put that on the table. So none of that, those aspects of war are not included in their simulation. And it reminds me of the same way, military recruiters get a pretty bad reputation, almost justifiably so, because they tend to be very dishonest. With people who are considering getting into the military, they give you some pretty unrealistic expectations going in, and a lot of my friends thought they were going to have some other job when they got in. They end up in the infantry just like everybody else. And it's basically, I think especially since we don't have a draft, maybe the Pentagon and the other associated military elements within our government think that, their only tool really to recruit people at that point is propaganda, getting us in to risk our lives, in the name of, patriotism is what they're telling us. But, as the work of General Smedley D. Butler calls for, his book, War is a Racket, which you can find for free on PDF. It's really old. You find out once you've been in the military for a long time, you start to get a feeling for, who you're really fighting for. And, of course, none of that's ever in the video games. When you play through Modern Warfare 2, there are a couple situations where you've got to do some really bad things, but for the most part, you're always the hero. And I think that's one of the reasons that, those games, they manage to slide by, because you're not really contemplating what real war would be like, and in some cases, like the Metal Gear Solid games, that character actually starts turning into a peace activist over the course of the story. And unlike Modern Warfare 2, they do get into some of the basically the down parts of being in war. Like when they shoot this one character, Sniper Wolf, she's a female Kurd, and she goes into telling her sad story about what happened to her in Iraq and things like that. And I was like, wow, this is kind of unique, because they don't normally get into this in these military games. It's all about, G.I. Joe is great, and, everybody go along with that. There's all this glory involved, snap to, salute, salute the flag, everything's great, mom and apple pie, leave out all the little negatives. So, now, I got to ask, first of all, the only mild criticism I had was that the film was kind of short. Is there any reason for that? Well,
I was interested more in kind of tailoring the film to audience attention span.
Right.
40 minutes is about, it's not feature length, but it's really good for the genre that I was working in, which is mainly like classroom video. 40 minutes to an hour, and also sort of television documentary in the genre of something like PBS's Frontline. So, yeah, it's a little short. I had a range of activists that I was interviewing, and I was kind of surprised that a lot of them weren't very as articulate as I'd like them to have been about their own projects,
right.
Reflective about them. And though they had really interesting ideas, very provocative kinds of images and whatnot, they weren't exactly able to contextualize them and talk about the significance of their projects, or even really why they were doing them. I think they had an intuitive sense of why they worked and
right.
what they were saying. But the three that I focused on, I decided to go all out, give 15 minutes apiece, let them tell their stories in depth, provide a lot of context, kind of fill out and really curate the story so that it did a lot more, I think, in the video than it did in its actual execution, because I tried to add all these layers to it. So, I did pare it down to 3 because I thought there were 3 really powerful stories, and they complemented each other well, and they fit within, the 40 minutes to an hour that I was kind of wanting to fit them in.
Right. No, in the end, I'm still very glad I watched it, obviously, and I'm fully intending to buy it when, whenever I get the money. But I was curious if there was, some other reasoning that explains it perfectly. And I know what you mean about activists. It's kind of sad that, sometimes you run into these kids and it's like they're activists because they think it's cool to be anti-conformist. They don't necessarily understand why they're doing so. Maybe it's just because it's them appealing to their inner need to be rebellious or whatever. And I get what you mean there. But it kind of moves us on to the second story. We were just talking about Counter-Strike, and that would be the nice lady that you had on from Velvet Strike, I guess, which was a large group of activists who were going into the game Counter-Strike and spraying like peace messages and stuff on the walls within the game. Do you want to give any details about that?
Yeah, that was headed by Anne-Marie Schleiner. She's a hacker and hacktivist and computer programmer. She also designs games. Currently living in Singapore. She had to move there with her husband. He was, I believe, recently, he had his green card. He was living with her in the United States. But they were doing some installation art projects that were criticizing how the U.S.-Mexico border was being policed. And the INS came down on him and at the last minute denied him citizenship. And so they ended up having to move to Singapore. Kind of a weird story. She was working in Singapore when I interviewed her, which was a nice trip, among other things. And her group was about, I think, 4 or 5 people. Called themselves Velvet Strike. And they developed a couple of different strands of activism within the Counter-Strike online world. And one of them was they developed these, what they called sprays, which were a kind of game hack that allowed a player to go in and spray paint the wall of the virtual environment with some kind of message or image. And some of these were kind of cute. Some of them were kind of corny. Some of them were interesting and provocative. A huge kind of spray that said, "War is funny." Another one was hostages of military fantasy. Anything from peace signs to teddy bears and hearts. One of them that I thought was really clever was, and this speaks to your point before when you talk about the invisibility of, civilians on the ground in some of these games. They spray painted a hopscotch sidewalk mark on the ground, which is the last thing you're going to see in Counter-Strike. I mean, it might as well be on the moon, even though it, has many of the accoutrements of a Middle Eastern town. Because there are no civilians, there's no sign that anyone lives there, just a bunch of people with guns running around.
Right.
I mean, and the guns sound and are designed in the same way realistic guns guns work in the real world, of course, and the sound of somebody pulling a pin on a grenade is perfectly reproduced, but of course there are no civilians in sight. They're just empty buildings that you can run through.
That's an interesting point. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, adding a hopscotch, hopscotch game on the ground is a very interesting counterpoint to that world, and kind of draws attention to things that have been written out of that world.
Right, and that's an interesting point, actually, that you'll notice even within our news coverage. They do their best to keep it just as sterile, I guess the word would be. It's like they sterilize the life out of the battle scenes. And I think that's one of the reasons why that WikiLeaks video that was linked to, with the Apache helicopter shooting up those people on a street corner was so shocking to us, is because we're accustomed to seeing the filtered version of it, where, of course, you're not going to see anybody's body parts flying all over the place. And one of the more enraging things about that actually is more relevant to your point about the hopscotch is that The guy drives up. He doesn't really know what's going on. He's in a van. He's got his 2 kids in the back. He sees a man, lying on the ground dying, so he gets out of his van to help the person, and then the helicopter is begging to let them shoot. Then they get him on there, and then they just light up the van with the Apache's gun, which is capable of killing people within a vehicle for sure. And then, the thing of it is that at the end of all this, the pilots say, yeah, you shouldn't have brought your kids to a war zone. And I'm like, their home is the war zone, dipshit. Pardon me for the little bit of an S-bomb there, but this is where they live. That's why he was driving down the street with his kids in the car. This is where he lives. This is, and that's the funny thing is, like, as you pointed out, in Counter-Strike, it really is, there's no evidence of anything, really. It's sort of, basically, you basically see an area with a lot of buildings in it, but there's nobody there. And obviously there's no evidence of children or toys or anything like that. There's no evidence that anybody actually lives there. It's like there's just these buildings that are all over the world that have no other purpose other than people wandering around and shooting each other in them. And that leaves another aspect that just kind of, once again, sterilizes it, keeps the whole human element off the table so people don't have to be distracted by little things like reality. And that's, it's interesting that, when we were just talking about that is obviously is that the way that the news coverage works, I remember mentioning this in the blog too, was the fact that the majority of the kill shots that you see on the news are, really blurry, low quality, laser guided bombs shots that you're seeing from, the plane's point of view where you don't get to see anybody dying, that it's implied, and of course, the reason that they need to do those shots with the laser-guided bombs and all the advanced technology is to justify the military-industrial complex's, budget. We have these super fancy weapons, and we're going to put them on as commercials in the news over and over again to get, to convince you that you need them. And then and the funny thing is that within, for example, Modern Warfare 2, there's a point at which you're on the AC-130 gunship, which is basically a cargo plane rigged with all kinds of big guns, and you're doing that same kind of stuff. It looks exactly like what you see on TV, as you compared, in the beginning of your film. This is the video game. This is the real, the real thing. The news coverage, and you're blowing up people from really high up, and they're just kind of moving dots. They don't look like people. You're not going to see their arms flying off or anything. It's a person, but you don't really have that in your mind from that distance. And the whole time you're just thinking, man, this is so cool. I'm using these extremely destructive weapons, and you find yourself enjoying it because, yeah, man, do you remember that cool part in Modern Warfare 2 where you got to blow up people from 1,000 feet up and use all kinds of destructive weapons? That was the other aspect of it, that I think that when you brought it up in Militainment, you're talking about the news coverage. And when you bring it up in Returning Fire, it's when they take the news and take it not only from the perspective of entertainment, but they turn it into a game, something that you let your kids do, in your living room. Is they're blowing up random people, Go ahead.
Well, that was a really important moment in modern Medal of Honor, what you're describing. Or was it Call of Duty? It was Medal of Honor, right?
Which one? The C-130?
AC-130, was it?
That was Modern Warfare 2.
Okay, it was. Okay.
Pretty sure.
Yeah. But there was a point when long-distance warfare, the kind of image of long-distance warfare that the population had been trained on, which is, the shot of the ground, infrared little dots, bodies running around, explosions, AC-130 gunship pilots talking about there he's going into the mosque, we can't shoot that, or he's going into this little house, light that up.
Right.
The fact that it could enter into a video game with such ease means that it had already, on television news, been translated into the visual language of the video game already. It had already been translated for the person sitting on the couch watching CNN or Fox into a kind of very pleasurable kind of interactive experience almost, right? Where
right.
gazing and scanning the ground and shooting little dehumanized dots with one's eyeballs. So, that was an interesting moment where, this kind of very low resolution, long distance war image was translated directly into the visual language of video games, and so easily as well.
Right. And that's, the messed up thing about that, in addition, like I was remembering from the blog I talked about the A10 Warthog, and ironically in your Militainment film, there's a guy who says, I really like the A10 Warthog, it's my favorite. It used to be my favorite too. And one of the things that got me over that was there's a documentary, I think it's Iraq Conspiracy, but it's a brief documentary about Iraq, and it's about the time that we had just 2 A-10 Warthogs catch the majority of the Iraqi army fleeing Kuwait, and we decided to open up on them. And I didn't know. I mean, I knew what cluster bombs looked like on the military channel because they looked like a pretty fireworks display. I had no idea what a cluster bomb looks like when it's used on a human being until I saw the footage in this documentary where you've got people that are heated up and basically fused to their vehicles. Their bodies are just absolutely horribly torn to pieces or, singed to the point of almost not being recognizable. They don't. That's another aspect of that, it's like we see these things from the distance. People have no concept of the amount of destructive power that you're raining down on people with these weapons. They don't ever go into the building afterwards and show you what it looks like when you have all these people blown to pieces. And that's like, and to pieces is a really important part of that. And I know I keep mentioning this, but it reminds me of a moment in the film Saving Private Ryan, when this GI gets his arm blown off, and he's so lost in the moment, he doesn't really grasp or comprehend what it means that his arm is not connected to him. So he picks it up and carries it with him as if maybe he could talk to a medic and see about fixing that. That's the level of desensitization that a soldier gets into in the field, and it almost seems like this could be part of something that is trying to desensitize that, for us here in the, in the real world. And that's, I really hope not. And I wanted to say, this is not that big a deal, but, as I mentioned, the character in that Boy Who Could Fly film, and remembered that used to be me and that I wanted to be part of this whole thing, it definitely was real to me, in the retrospect when I sat and thought about it. I'm like, everything about the first quarter of my life was military. Everything. I wanted to be a fighter pilot, period. That was it. I was absolutely going to do that, and it was all based on the video games and the toys of the times, and how much that transformed me, infected me, essentially, was in me from top to bottom. And, I think, Roger, since, you've worked so hard on both of these projects and so long, was there ever a time period in your life that, that you've looked back on now that you've done this work and gone, man, I can't believe I ever felt that way about a fighter plane or something like that?
Oh, yeah, I went through exactly the same thing that you went through. I don't think it was as intense, but I remember my group of friends, having entire rooms filled with model airplanes, that knew exactly the specs from, the new stealth bomber all the way to the F-14 Tomcat or whatever, knowing exactly when to put them out, having, sneak previews, like model companies get sneak previews of new designs, they come out with the plane even before the military comes out with the plane. We'd be all over that, as of course I got older and started to sort of investigate, the realities of conflict, and got very interested in the first Gulf War, and the fact that it was very pretty really intrigued me. It was sort of unlike what I remember my parents, they talked about the Vietnam War as it was depicted on the news, very ugly thing for the most part.
Yes.
Late in the war when the press started following public opinion and then decided they were going to show ugly photos of what was going on. So that sort of intrigued me at a very early age. I was about 14 when the first Gulf War happened, and I happened at that time to be on the debate squad, and so investigating that very heavily because it was one of our debate topics.
Right.
The United States have gone into Kuwait, and just being really struck by the level that the nation rallied around the flag, the lack of any kind of discourse regarding the question, even the question of whether or not we ought to be involved in this conflict, and just the sheer beauty and sort of technological spectacle that it represented on television. Coming out of fighter plane model culture and coming out of G.I. Joe culture, that hit me, I think, in ways and at a crucial period that perhaps others who hadn't gone through that whole process might not have felt, but I felt it. And it stirred up a lot of questions, as well as sort of, I was as satisfied as anybody about the beauty of that war and the heroism and the drama at that age. And I, of course, knew no better. But I think I was even more tuned into it as a mode of satisfaction, as a mode of pleasure, as a mode of aesthetic appreciation than most other people, just because of the age group I was in, the process I was going through at that point.
Which, ironically, that is the age group that's thinking about, signing up. So it works out perfectly. They are targeting that age group for sure. I gotta imagine, particularly with your work as a professor, do you talk to your students about this, or would that get you in trouble, or what?
Well, talk to my students about
this kind of stuff, right? They just as in the fact that they're being targeted, by the military-industrial complex for recruitment.
Well, I've gone through kind of a process there too. Very early on, when I started becoming interested in this kind of thing after 9/11. After 2003, March, when we invaded Iraq, there was a similar rally around the flag feeling, and a lot of this kind of critical approach to understanding how these images were working was almost, verboten in the university. Critically talking about this kind of stuff may have gotten me into trouble. It didn't. I was very careful. But it didn't take long before students, I think it was the next year, I witnessed a dramatic change in the class that I was teaching. It was a special topics class on media and war. And the kinds of discussions we could have only a year after that invasion just changed dramatically.
Right.
Students would open up. They, I don't think students ever wrote me off or, charged that I was anti-American or something like that because we were investigating some of these issues. But I could tell that the students were a lot more willing to talk about them, a lot more skeptical about, how some of these images and stories were working in their lives. And, from about 2004 to 2007, there was a tremendous amount of interest. And then in 2007, just as the story of Iraq and Afghanistan was dropping off the front page and finding its way to page 16 of the New York Times, student interest dropped way off.
Right.
The war just didn't register anymore. It wasn't. It was like a low noise hum in the background of the mediascape.
Yeah, now it just doesn't exist. They're desensitized to the fact that there are still thousands of people dying over there. Mm-hmm. It's amazing that we can just forget about something like that, and that's brings me back to that Star Trek episode that I mentioned in the blog, wherein those people had decided that it would be better to wage war via computer simulation because of the horrors of war. So they decided that they would just set up a computer simulation, and if you were deemed to be killed during this simulation, well then you would just go willingly disintegrate yourself because it was more humane that way. and how long the war went on because of the fact that those people were so desensitized to the reality of what it is they were doing. And that actually kind of brings me to the third and final point that I have to admit I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about by the time I was finished. The part about that Iraqi gentleman whose father had been killed by a remote Predator drone, which, as many people are not aware, the Predator drones in many cases are piloted by people here in the United States. They're not even piloted by anybody over there, and that's the direction that warfare is moving as time goes on. Sorry. And he basically just set up a paintball gun and locked himself in a room for 30 days and hooked up the paintball gun to the internet to see if people would shoot him. When you look at that, like I said, I mean, now that I'm speaking of it derisively, of course, but like, if you just left the fact that he was an Iraqi out of this, and maybe the whole fact that we're talking about a war film here, you would think that was the most ridiculous thing you'd ever heard. You'd start laughing, and you'd be like, oh, where's this website? I'm totally going to shoot this guy. The whole point behind it that was lost on me until you really sit and watch what this poor guy is going through, especially since even just this stupid paintball gun started to have psychological effects on him. And that reminded me, because I've played paintball before, and I went out on a camping trip shortly after I was finished playing paintball, and I heard like a whoop noise. Somebody had opened a bottle or something, and I literally hit the ground because I'd been playing paintball for 3 days straight. You don't think that it would have an effect on you, but just that noise had a serious effect on me, and that's not even something that's going to kill me. Paintballs just sting a lot, enough to get your brain to react, ironically. But still, to lock himself up for 30 days, doing that, I mean, talking to that guy had to have been a very unique experience, and I'm glad that he did it. I mean, I'm going to give you go ahead and elaborate on that a little bit, and then I'll talk about my next point on that.
Yeah, he had been in the United States since about 1991 when he escaped the clutches of Saddam Hussein, who wanted to draft him into the Iraqi army. So this was, 1991 when Iraq was rolling into Kuwait. So Wafa Bilal, the guy that you're talking about, escaped and emigrated to the United States, ended up in Chicago eventually, and left his family behind. And then as 2003 rolled around, he was thinking about perhaps some ways of engaging war culture as it is happening in the United States. And then about 2004, late 2004, you said his father had been killed. Actually,
right.
His brother.
Oh, okay.
His father did die soon thereafter of grief because of the brother's death. But this got Wafa Bilal thinking about drones, long-distance warfare, disconnection, and how not only the military sees the battlefield now from a station in Nevada with a joystick, but how we as a society kind of see it as it is translated through the medium that we're most familiar with, which is video games. Perhaps the AC-130 gunship level on Medal of Honor 2. So he devised an installation, the kind that you talked about, set up a paintball gun with a camera on it and allowed people to go online to this website and move the camera around and the gun, aim it at it and shoot him. And he stayed in this room for 30 days and was shot at about 65,000 times. And 80 million people came to this website, and there was a chat room, and there was all kinds of conversation. And eventually all kinds of media got involved, television, radio, newspapers, and started this huge conversation. I think this project was interesting because it didn't necessarily moralize, right? It's sort of by word of mouth or by viral means. You heard about this site, you go there, and you have this experience where you're, invited to look through this very video game-like monitor or something that you might see on television, kind of this grainy image with a gun. It's even got the gun sticking out from the bottom like a first-person shooter. And you aim it and you shoot at somebody, a live person in a room. You find out this person is Iraqi. You find out this person's story. Eventually all these things come to light. And it's a very transformative and cathartic kind of experience, and was for a lot of people. And Wafa Bilal didn't have to make an argument. He didn't have to directly relate this to video game culture or drone culture, all these things that we're now very familiar with. All he had to do was draw people into a situation where they then had to, they had to confront all these things, inevitably. I remember when I heard about it, I didn't even know he was an Iraqi, and I went to this room, and I was going to shoot him, and then I just couldn't bring myself to actually shoot him, point the gun
right.
out. So I pointed it in the corner and shot the gun. Another student of mine shot him. But this is sort of before. This is the initiation point of the process before you learn his story, and his story really starts to resonate and turn the whole narrative on its head. I wanted to focus on in this film the whole idea of living under the gun, the sort of experiential level, which is something that he talked about when he appeared in various news venues. But I tried to curate that as best I could, try to give a sense of what it's like in this room, and also try to connect that to, how he was thinking about his family. I mean, his family is still in Iraq. His family is still, as he says, dodging bullets. There's still ever-present kind of buzz of drone aircraft. Hellfire missile could come from any of those and kill anyone, just like it accidentally killed his brother at any time. And we don't, we talk about brutality and gore and the realities of war, people dying, charred bodies and whatnot. I mean, really, the reality of an occupation is just the brutality of everyday existence, the brutality of everyday anxiety, the brutality of knowing that it's difficult to walk down the street and get groceries. Right now, they're in my hometown. In fact, pretty close to where I live, there's an escaped cop killer on the loose right now. And
oh man!
Him down. And the level of terror that has inflicted on this town. This guy's going around carjacking people and putting them in his trunk. He killed a police officer the other day. The level of terror that has, descended upon this very small town, Athens, Georgia, is palpable. And, we're just talking about one guy who's running around town, who may or may not be a threat. But when you're talking about an entire society, where a third of the population has left and have become refugees, 2/3 of the population are still remaining, about 100,000 people, which is about 1/25 of the population of Iraq, up to a million, which is about 1/25 of the population of Iraq, has been casualties since 2003. We're talking about, not just a few soldiers coming home with post-traumatic stress disorder. We're talking about on the order of 25 million people who are living day to day what a soldier who may come home with post-traumatic stress disorder lived for perhaps 6 months or a year. We're talking about the devastation of an entire society, not just the death of a number of civilians, but we're talking about PTSD on a mass scale. And
right.
We're talking about Iraq and not Afghanistan. I mean, it's just staggering to think about the kind of thing that Wafa Bilal was trying to represent with this project. I mean, it's a really weak representation of something almost unfathomable.
And that's this conversation is really good. I'm going to extend the show just a little bit if you don't mind.
Problem.
But basically, you're very right about that, and that's especially maybe I am a little bit more understanding about it because I grew up in the inner city in a really, really, really bad neighborhood, wherein I could be shot at any time. It was obviously still nowhere near the scale of what people go through in Iraq. That's why I keep telling people to check out the film Heavy Metal in Baghdad, because you're seeing the life of I think it's like 5 Iraqi young men who speak really good English, so it allows you to identify with them a little bit more. And then you see video it's not just about being a good man and staying out of the way and then you'll be all right. In the situation over there, particularly with some of the crazier people that we have working for us, like Blackwater, that video I'm sure you've seen of those Blackwater mercenaries playing country music and randomly driving down an Iraqi street shooting up people's cars with the people inside them, obviously, for no reason other than personal amusement. You can imagine what it would be like to live in that situation, and then we wonder why we're not popular over there. And that's the Iraqis that I've talked to when I was running for Congress told me that they didn't like Saddam, but and there was certainly an amount of fear with Saddam, but there was still a crazy amount of fear in comparison, now over there with the endless fighting, and you never know who's going to shoot you. You don't know whose side you're on, even if you think you do. That comes back to what we were talking about earlier about that pilot's comment on, that's for what you get for bringing your kids to a war zone. Where are they supposed to go? And then you got to imagine what was going through that man's head. He's got his kids. In the back of his van. He sees a man dying on the side of the road. He doesn't know the situation, and he's got to decide whether or not it's worth it for him to risk his children's lives to get this man in a van to take him to a hospital. These are the kinds of decisions that the average person in America, especially those kids, as you pointed out, who the war just doesn't exist for them, they've never contemplated that. They don't understand that. That doesn't even register on their radar. And that's one of the reasons I was actually looking forward to, in an indirect sort of way, they were making another Red Dawn film. And this one would be about China. And one of the spookiest parts about it was I've seen some of the YouTube footage, raw YouTube footage that people took because they were shooting this film here in Detroit, Michigan, of Chinese tanks driving down the street, and shooting mock bullets at, people in Detroit streets, and how that really messed with me because I've been down those streets. The realism of the idea that there's a tank driving down a street in Detroit, was really terrifying to me, in that one moment. It certainly wasn't cool. And it certainly, and the funny thing is that I don't think people have ever contemplated that. We in the United States in particular, there's one of the things that France pointed out about the Iraq war they weren't so okay with is that they had lived through occupation, and they didn't want to see anybody else go through that. That's something that I think most people in the United States don't really understand. People in the United Kingdom know what it's like to be bombed, but they've never been occupied. And then there's this group of people who show up here and they've destroyed all of your infrastructure, and they've, of course, secured all of your oil, and you're supposed to live through that. You're supposed to be somehow, through all of that, supporting the people that did that to your country, and for some reason they're not doing any better. People in the chat room who are asking where you can see my review, if you go to v-radio.org, you will, and then click blog. The name of the review is called It's Just a Game. And that actually brings me back, ironically, as I was just going to point out, was that, when you're shooting at the quote-unquote Taliban or Iraqis or the terrorists or whatever in any of these video games, they don't leave any of that. They don't put any of that on the table either. They don't put any of the realities of what the motivations of these people might be when they're shooting at you. That's never part of the game, so to speak, because once again that wouldn't be appealing. And Go ahead.
Oh well, yeah, you're absolutely right about that. One of the features of war games in general is that they shrink context down to a very depoliticized level. So it's actually possible, if you're talking about something like Call of Duty number 2, and I believe 3 is going to feature something like this. It got into a lot of trouble because you could play an American or a coalition soldier, but you could also play Taliban. You could face off with an American soldier. And so, there was actually kind of fevered discussions on Fox News and some other places where military families, were quite angered and incensed that a video game would allow players to, assume avatars that were shooting at American soldiers. But that's one of the features of video games, war-themed video games these days. They're highly realistic, but they're realistic to a very localized degree. They're realistic in terms of terrain and weapons and the aesthetics of, gear and uniforms, and even, realistic situations that mimic, real places in the world. But in terms of providing context or motivation for why the conflict even exists, right? Who's occupying whom? Why some people, might decide to defend their homes or their homeland, or the motivations. It's turned into a kind of capture the flag game at the end of the day, where there are very localized types of conflicts and contests that crowd out any kind of reflection about what context might have provoked this conflict in the first place.
Right. I guess that's, I'm thinking back on all of that, particularly is you don't hear any outcry about the fact that, they're making the people you're shooting at look like realistic Arabs. You don't hear any outcry for the other half of that. And I'm not saying that it's any better that Arabs or white people or whatever we're creating the avatars to look like are getting shot. That's actually a poignant point that I make that is sometimes kind of controversial in my internet activism, is that when people get all up in arms about Gaza, and don't get me wrong, I'm up in arms about Gaza too, I don't really look at that as quite the same way as other people do, because there are still completely peaceful people who live in Israel who get blown up, who have nothing to do with any of the stuff going on in Gaza, by random members of Hamas strapping bombs to themselves and blowing themselves up in, Israeli coffee shops. The problem is war in general. The idea that this is the means by which we have to achieve any kind of social end, and that somehow we think that it works when it really doesn't. I mean, it does for the winner for a while, but we're seeing how that's working out here in the United States. We're getting, less and less, basically, we're getting less and less popular, around the world. That could possibly have some economic problems for us, and that's, especially because I've heard that, for example, they're talking about not accepting the dollar for their exchanges anymore because they're getting tired of American imperialism. In that Iraq conspiracy film that I watched, it was actually a British BBC documentary. I know it says conspiracy, so people would immediately assume it was hokey, but I thought it was actually really well done. They pointed out that Saddam Hussein was seriously considering changing his oil trade to the euro, and that likely had a lot to do with the motive for invading Iraq. Those are the kinds of global implications for what happens, if we do all of this, and that's, honestly, in some ways, I like it, and in some ways I don't. I mean, I really wish, for example, I could go to Iraq and get a feel for what it is that we've done there. I'd be worried that I'd get targeted for the things that other people had done, obviously. It would be difficult. That's why, for that documentary film, Meeting Resistance, I think I told you about, those two British journalists risked their lives to go and interview members of the resistance in Iraq, and the consistent story that they heard was, no, we're not Baathists. In fact, if I found a Baathist, I'd probably shoot them. The Ba'ath Party was not good for us, but I would kind of like my water to work again. I would like my electricity to work again. I would like my babies to stop being born with cancer. not born with cancer, but they develop cancer at very young ages. They're born deformed frequently due to the depleted uranium that we've released in the desert. So it's getting all over the place.
Yep.
In that dusty climate. Those are the elements of the situation that they don't talk about, and I guess it's best left off the table. When that's basically, especially the fact that was the part of it, and that was actually another thing from the earlier part of the film that you talked about, like with the first fellow, when that kid was like, you're trivializing the death of my brother because his brother had died as a soldier in Iraq. And, the guy pointed out, no, these video games where you're playing a soldier running around getting shot trivialize the death of your brother. And I think that was a really important counterpoint. I'd be interested to hear that interview, to hear how the kid reacted to that. It wasn't in the film, but still, I don't understand what answer he would have had about that. If you're going to be upset that somebody put their name, put your brother's name, when he died and where in a video game about, Iraq, because that's basically what America's Army is. It's about Iraq and Afghanistan and the various adventurers in the United States is engaging in. Why aren't you upset that they have a video game where you're going in and, you can shoot at, as you pointed out, American-looking avatars, where you were playing one and getting shot at over and over again, wherein the unfortunate circumstances of your brother's death are a portion of a game. I guess that's one of the reasons that I'm happy that I watched your films, because it enabled a transformation enabled a transformation for me to be able to see the truth of that matter for what it really was, which was that essentially trivializing death, making it part of entertainment, and also in a ways of ensuring, as you pointed out, Militainment, ensuring that we support wars even if they don't have any justification, because they're cool. Like you pointed out when we did the first invasion, it was pretty. They didn't show us that's another aspect of that. They showed us those pictures of the explosions. You included those in the film, the first explosions. And they don't show. That's another thing. They don't show what happened at ground zero of those explosions. Obviously, they don't take you to the scene afterwards. Which it wouldn't be very practical for any journalist to do that anyway. But I still remember seeing some pretty graphic pictures of Uday and Saddam's other son. I always forget his name. Hussein. They were both dead. And just blown to smithereens. They were mutilated. And I remember being shocked about the fact that they even let us see that, but because they were some of the bad guys, that was good. It was okay to see them blown up. They were bad people. Don't get me wrong, Uday Hussein, the reason I remember him is because he had some pretty, bad habits from what I understand, including, raping girls and stuff like that. So, he certainly wasn't a model citizen, but it's interesting that they put all of that stuff together and they're very specific about what they'll let you see. And I don't think that anybody has ever really fully put it together in their heads and grasped that we are playing a video game wherein we are simulating the death of another person. I'm not going to repeat myself too much, but, somebody's brother, somebody's mother, somebody's somebody, somebody who somebody cared about, had dreams, interests, their favorite music, their favorite color. None of that is in any way factored into the equation. The things that make us real living beings are not factored into the equation.
I think a really interesting film that some of your viewers, your listeners, might be interested in, if they can find it, it's called Deadline Iraq. It was produced by the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company. And, you make the point that, often in war zones, especially when heavy bombing has been done, it's tough to get in and see the aftermath, what happened on the ground. And there's a couple of, I suppose, exceptions to that rule. One of them is Peter Turnley, the photographer who went in and photographed the Mile of Death, which is the strafed Iraqi army, and there are a lot of civilians involved in that too. The sort of long line of retreating civilian and military vehicles when Saddam Hussein pulled out of Kuwait, basically strafed, and that's where you get all these pictures of charred bodies in trucks and whatnot. There are some moments, Uday and Keirsey Hussein, where the effects on the body are visible suddenly. But I don't think it's because, the lack of this kind of imagery is not because reporters don't have access to it, or that, this kind of footage is not available. It's available, and I suppose if you scour the right corners of the net, you can find it very easily. But the reason I mentioned this film, Deadline Iraq, is because it sort of features all of the stuff that these reporters, embedded reporters and unilaterals, had collected, and they basically tell the story of how they, experienced these horrific things. They got it on tape. They could tell these stories, but by the time they got to their editors and presented them with the photo or the story, whatever they wanted to tell, they could not get through that filter. They could not get through that wall that protects the, British and American citizen from seeing the body. The body has to be hidden, and news organizations know exactly what they need to do in order to maintain access to the military leadership, to maintain access to the battlefield and the stories that are coming from the battlefield. They have to please that military leadership, and one way of pleasing them is hide the body, and that's exactly what they did. So it's not exactly the case that those bodies are not available to reporters. They reach a certain level, and then they are filed away and never seen again until something like WikiLeaks makes the story and makes the story tellable by mainstream news.
Right. That's the same thing with those prison photos. The photos of what we're doing to prisoners in Guantanamo and places like it. That's another one of those things that I don't see anybody ever contemplating what it would be like to be in their shoes. To see the things that are being done in our name, like that, and then remember all that crap they put that poor guy through who released those photos of the reverence that they treat the coffins with, and the flags. I think you probably remember what I'm talking about. They were very tasteful photos, and ironically, a mother of a fallen soldier was really upset that they went after the guy because she was so pleased to see the respect and the all that they treated the fallen soldiers with, saluting the coffins with the flags on them, but it was so important to the media and to the government. The concept that people are actually dying here was not part of the conversation. And without a draft, it's pretty easy to forget that. That is one thing that the Vietnam War had that we don't. It was a little hard for people to ignore the Vietnam War because of the draft. You never knew. Any young person you knew, your son, you even might get pulled over there whether you agreed with the war or not. And that made it more real for some people. And as you pointed out, the differences in the way that the media handled it, but I mean, you do remember the photos I'm talking about, right?
Well, I think you're talking about, Bush 1 and also the Clinton administration, Bush 2, put a ban on press access to returning U.S. coffins. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
And some of these coffin photos snuck through. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you remind me of something else, too. Boy, what did you remind me of? Oh, never mind. Maybe it'll come back to me.
Well, we were talking about let me see, the Vietnam War and how it was changed, in the draft.
Oh yes. In I think it was 2003, and it was kind of a protest move by a couple of senators, Democratic senators. They decided to, in the midst of all the talk about the potential reintroduction of a draft, to introduce a bill that would require universal service by everyone who turned 18 in the United States. Would be kind of like the Israeli system or some of the Scandinavian systems where they require everybody to spend a little bit of time in the military. Universal service bill. And of course, that didn't go over very well. It didn't go over very well for people who didn't want the draft. And even some of the senators that introduced the bill voted against it, but it was sort of a symbolic gesture, because right now we don't even have a draft, as you mentioned, and we've got a very stratified U.S. military that is very reliant on lower income recruits, and then is also shifting much of its manpower into the private sector, into private military contractors. So the level of investment and involvement the average American citizen has in the military has dropped significantly. We either think of it as a private contractor endeavor, a corporate endeavor, or we think of it as something that poor people do when they can't find a job. And the idea that, a middle-class John or Jane Doe's son or daughter might be drafted or might have to, be transported to some conflict around the world because of perhaps universal service rule or something like that doesn't exist. And, you have to wonder, what effect does this have on our national psyche? How much more willing are we to pull the trigger when the president says, hey, let's go to war somewhere, let's occupy some other country, than if we were to have a universal service requirement where every son and daughter were required to put in some time in the military. How much more of an ethical foreign policy would we have? How much more would we care about having 50,000 or 100,000 people still stationed in Iraq, in a very dangerous area, or 25,000 in Afghanistan? That would be a very different situation.
That's something that Jacques Fresco talked about, is that we should institute that if we're gonna have a draft, then absolutely everybody gets drafted, including all of the members of Congress and all the members of the Senate and the president. Everybody gets to serve. That was and he said that with that kind of system in place, you're obviously going to have a country that's going to be considerably less interested in going to war, because in Vietnam they would protect the rich kids by allowing them to say, well, I'm not going because I paid for college, and now it's more of a matter of, basically, just as we said earlier, that the people who are getting pushed into it are the ones who can't find, a gainful employment anywhere else. And that's tough. In particular, fortunately enough, none of my friends who've went into the military have gotten hurt as of yet. But I remember one little shocker was we were talking to this friend of mine named Mike, and he was over there, and he's a really nice guy. He's got a little kid, a little boy, and a nice young wife, and he joined because he couldn't find money anywhere else, and at one point I'm talking to him on AOL Instant Messenger, AIM, and basically, we're talking, and he goes, BRB, be right back, AFK. And then he comes back 10 minutes later, and I'm like, so what was that about? And he's like, the tent next to me exploded. And I was like, holy shit, dude. Sorry for the S-bomb again. You took the time to type BRB, AFK, when the tent next to you exploded, and he was like, it happens all the time. Just all casual about that. Just once again, it's a different world when you're over there, and that's why, particularly when soldiers come back and try to interact with civilians, it is hard for them to take us seriously, especially when you consider some of the civilian populace in the United States are extremely spoiled. Their idea of a crisis is, I couldn't get my Xbox. They ran out of them at Walmart on the opening day of Christmas shopping. I'm going to be angry about that, and I'm going to flip out about that, and I'm going to, or maybe the person who I liked for American Idol didn't win. These are the things that civilians tend to think are important to them. You put a soldier into that situation, and they're just lost. Seriously? Really? You think that's a big deal? How are they supposed to relate to that society? It's not just about the violence. It's just about the total difference in attitude. And the other thing, I had another guy, kid who very clearly could not function outside of the military. He got in at a young age, and it was pretty clear that he was that kind of personality because he got in trouble with the law a couple times, things like that. And he had gotten out and was spending time with us at our live-action role-playing game, and he said he wanted to go back. And I was like, why would you ever want to go back? And he said, well, the military takes care of everything. You've always got a roof over your head. You've always got, food in your belly, and you've got insurance. They take care of you. And I'm just like, yeah, and they put you in the line of fire, But it didn't even occur to him. He was so dependent on the military system. It was like a prisoner who's gotten out of prison after being in prison for like 40 years or so. He could not handle life in a situation where he was not being taken care of by the military. It's tough that that this is happening to people, and that it's unfortunate also that I think that most people are not really going to grasp what this is like in their lifetime, and they will in turn go and vote for politicians who will take other people to war, without ever any understanding of what that means or what they're doing when they do so. Especially that generation you're talking about that has forgotten about the war in general. They don't even contemplate what that means because it's nobody that it's nobody they know. Sorry about that. Yeah. But in any case, so do we have any future projects on the horizon?
Yeah, well, I was just talking to another filmmaker, actually a group of people who are working on some larger projects. One of them is called War 2.0. They're interested in information warfare and generally how information culture, the image, and other kinds of immaterial symbolic activities have been translated into weapons or become thought about as weapons of war. The net and infrastructure of media has been translated into a kind of weapon. So they're thinking theoretically about that, and they've already done quite a bit of work. I've been invited to go on a trip to western Pakistan, where much of the drone warfare is happening right now. There's a huge kind of secret war that Obama is waging over the border of Pakistan from Afghanistan, and most of it involves the use of drone planes. And we've gotten hooked up with a number of people who live in these tribal areas, but also the cities that are east of these tribal areas. And they talk incessantly about the steady stream of civilian casualties that are filling up their hospitals. These drone warcraft are constantly flying overhead. There's a steady buzz and just a general presence and anxiety about where these aircraft are going to hit next. And there, like I said, is a steady stream of civilian casualties that are being transported to the cities, into the hospitals. So we've made contact with journalists who are working in this area and investigating the extent of the damage that drone warfare has caused, and also people who are working in these hospitals who are taking care of this constant stream of victims that is flooding the hospitals right now.
Pakistan is kind of the Cambodia of the Afghanistan conflict.
That's a pretty good analogy. Yep.
Yeah, that country that we're not actually in, supposedly, and we can't actually be in it because I guess they have nuclear weapons. I watched a documentary called Rethink Afghanistan, and it laid out the situation, and it's actually kind of silly. I mean, there's nothing silly about war, obviously, but the absurdity of the situation when it comes to the border of Pakistan is that, we're accustomed in the United States to borders being something that's established. There's road signs, there's different, maybe a checkpoint or something, and basically, the notion of crossing a border in that circumstance is so crazy because they point out where the borders are in this film, but if you had not been told, you'd have no idea where you were. It's just a big desert, featureless. there's not even. I mean, it's just it looks the same everywhere you go. I mean, I imagine people who live there could probably figure it out, but still, So, I mean, I also remember you were talking about possibly being in Peter's new film about war. Did you guys communicate any further about that yet?
No, we haven't talked too much about that.
Okay. Well, I look forward to that for sure, and it'll be good to have, you in one of his films. And since it's about a topic that obviously you can easily get behind, there won't be any conflicts there. And well, thanks again, Roger. We're down to the last 5 minutes, and I hope that I didn't babble too much. Having a fever on the radio is certainly a unique experience, but
it didn't slow you down at all.
Right. Once again, thank you for doing the work that you're doing. As a professor, I'm sure you could be doing a lot of things that would, rake you in a lot more money than making activist films that, are never going to be appreciated for their full, worth by most people, as sad as that is. But it is a step in the right direction to opening people up, and it certainly helped open me up. So, thanks again, and everybody. If you check out my blog, there you will see I have the trailer to the film at the top. You can read the review itself, and then at the very bottom there's a link to a website wherein you can reserve a copy of the film. It will be, or maybe is it already out today? I'm trying to remember when the release date was.
Yeah, the DVD is available right now.
Okay, good.
Also on track to appear in the European documentary TV market, so hopefully that goes through. But right now, if you are interested in having a sneak preview of it, I believe the link that you provided on your review goes to the Media Education Foundation site that hosts the film,
right.
And there you can watch the entire thing with a big watermark on it that says for preview use only, but you can get a sense of what the film is like.
Right. All right. Well, thanks again, and I'm going to go ahead and end this segment, Roger. And as always, it's a pleasure to have you on. Keep up the good work.
It's a pleasure to be on.
Thanks for coming to V Radio. All right, folks, go ahead. Was there something else, Roger?
Oh, I said thanks, Neil.
Oh, yeah. Here's some words from Jock Fresco and Roxanne Meadows.
This is Roxanne Meadows.
And this is Jock Fresco.
And you're listening to V Radio.